So my lab is specialized in eye movement analysis, and we are, as introduced earlier, with a very nice introduction from Professor Peng Gang. So we, in general, interested in learning and expertise acquisition. And these are today the study I'm going to present very briefly two previous studies and one more extensive study related to music reading experience and how modulation of music reading experience on sentence processing. It doesn't go to the next slide. Okay, good. So just a quick outline of the talk today. So I'll give a quick introduction and I will introduce two previous findings also from my lab related to music reading and language processing. And then I will introduce the current study. And in particular, in this study, we use a novel technique for eye movement analysis called eye movement analysis with hidden Markov models. And I'm going to introduce that to you today as well. Okay, so quick introduction. So in general, the research in my lab, we are interested in what the general principles are underlying transfer effects among perceptual expertise domains, and also how do processes in different expertise domain influence each other. So I study, in particular, face recognition, visual recognition, reading, and some other expertise. And then we're interested in how different expertise can influence each other. And then here we are particularly interested in music reading expertise because and also bilinguals, because English Chinese bilinguals provide a unique opportunity to examine how music reading expertise can influence English and Chinese reading differentially due to the similarities in perceptual processes involved in reading. So I'm going to explain a little bit more here. So what are the similarities in terms of perceptual processes among music reading, English reading, and Chinese reading? So if you look at, try to compare the stimuli, the perceptual properties of these stimuli for music notations, English sentences, and Chinese sentences. Then first of all, if you try to compare musical segments and English words, then they both involve horizontally arranged symbols from left to right. They are read from left to right, and each of these components will map to a component in pronunciation or in sound, such as the grapheme phoneme conversion in English word reading, and or the note to sound mapping in music notation reading. So this perceptual process is highly similar. And but then in contrast, if you look at Chinese characters, how we read Chinese characters, then we know that components in a Chinese character can appear in different configurations, and you can see some examples here. And also the components of the Chinese characters, they do not typically match to components in the pronunciation. They may be partially related, provide partial information, but typically at a syllable level, and they don't have a nice grapheme phoneme correspondence as in alphabetic languages. And how about another interesting differences between music, English, and Chinese reading is that in reading music notations, or in reading music notations or sentences in a language. So we know that for musical segments in music notations, they are separated. They are kind of roughly separated by space, like this, and then very more similar to words in English sentences because they are also separated by space. But in contrast, we know that in Chinese sentences, between words, there is no word boundaries. So in a way that in terms of eye movement planning, for example, then in general, planning eye movement during music notation reading and English sentence reading will be more similar as compared with Chinese sentence reading. So I'll just quickly introduce our previous studies on how music reading experience can influence visual word processing in Chinese English bilinguals. So this is a study kind of a few years back, published in Cognition. So so this is just going to be a very brief introduction. So okay. So in this study, we're interested in knowing about whether musicians and non-musicians, whether they process visual words differently because of musicians' music reading experience. So what we did in this study is that we did a very simple word naming task, but we present the words either in the left visual field or right visual field or in the center, and ask participants to name them as quickly as possible. And we have English word stimuli and also Chinese character stimuli. Then afterwards, we recorded musicians and non-musicians, and we try to compare their word naming performance when words are presented at different visual field locations. And then let's just go directly to the results. So you can see this shows participants' response time performance in English word naming, and the gray bar, the darker bars are for musicians, and then the lighter bars are for non-musicians. And this is left visual field, center, and right visual field. So you can see that musicians in general, they name English words faster in the left visual field locations and also in the center locations, suggesting that there seems to be some kind of left visual field, right hemisphere advantage in English word naming among musicians. However, you don't see this in Chinese character naming. Oh, sorry, this is unexpected. And then we did a follow-up study from ERP. We did a follow-up ERP study, and in this study, we asked participants to do a sequential matching, just to see whether two words presented sequentially are the same or different. And then the stimuli could be English words over Chinese characters. But the manipulation that we are doing here is that before the presentation of either English word or a Chinese character, we use a mask, and the mask could either be a musical segment or a Tibetan letter, which is a control condition. And then the general idea is I want to see whether by presenting musical segments before the presentation of either an English word or a Chinese word, somehow the perception of the musical segment will modulate the neural responses to the follow-up English word or Chinese characters. So we measured EEG signals, and we look at particularly the N170 component, and we found that so we have different types of stimuli: real words, pseudo words, and non-words. And the most interesting finding here is actually from non-words, which is kind of interesting. Originally, we thought that might be in other conditions as well, but somehow it's in non-words, and you can see that. So this is where N170 happens, and then so you can see the black line. So you should, first of all, you should compare the black line is for English non-words preceded by musical segments. And then the dash blue line is English words, but preceded by Tibetan letter string. So this is the control condition. So you can see that for musicians, when their perception of English words is preceded by a musical segment, then the N170 amplitude is significantly reduced. However, this effect was not observed in non-musicians. So in other words, here we see that musicians had reduced N170 responses to English non-words. And forgot to mention, so this is measured from PA, so this is in the right hemisphere. We didn't see that effect in the left hemisphere. So musicians had reduced right hemisphere N170 responses to English non-words under the processing of musical segments as compared with non-musicians. So this suggests that indeed there's some kind of shared visual processing mechanism in the right hemisphere between music notation and English non-word reading. So this is consistent with our earlier finding in naming, where we found the advantage of English word naming in the left visual field, but not in the right visual field. So a quick summary of this study. So here in this study, we found that music reading expertise modulates right hemisphere visual processing in English but not in Chinese, suggesting that there are shared mechanisms in the right hemisphere between music notation and English language reading. And these shared mechanisms may be related to the letter by letter serial visual processing that characterize right hemisphere English word recognition. So this has been reported in the past, which may consequently facilitate English word processing in the right hemisphere in musicians. And then this study also suggests that music reading experience may have differential influences on the processing of different languages in bilinguals, depending on their similarities in the cognitive process involved. Okay, so this is our first study looking at this issue. And then we did another study. We look at visual span, how music reading experience will modulate visual span in English reading and Chinese reading in Chinese English bilinguals. And this is a study published in Journal of Vision. So in here, we use a pretty standard visual span paradigm that we use different stimuli. We have English letters and also Chinese characters. And the procedure looks like this. So this is like commonly used in visual span studies. So they start from, here says drift correction because we actually put on an eye tracker to monitor participants' eye fixation to make sure that they look at the center when they do the judgment. So after the central fixation, then they keep looking at here, then we will present basically a big array of stimuli filled up the whole screen, but only for 200 milliseconds. And then with the stimulus type, sometimes it's in one block, it's English letters, in another block is Chinese characters. And we have other stimuli as well. But I will focus on talking about these two stimuli. And then after this, basically really just a flash of stimuli, then we will present a stimulus in one of the locations, and participants have to judge whether this presented letter is the same as the stimulus that was presented at the same location during this display. So this is to test whether they are able to identify under this condition, whether they can identify individual letters. And so the analysis is a little bit complicated here. So I just try to make the story a little bit simpler to understand. So to examine the visual span size, what we did is that we look at participants' performance in different regions. So you can see that if participants is looking at the center, so we separate into right visual field, left visual field, and either it's in the center, intermediate, or peripheral region. And then we look at these cells, the performance, whether their the stimulus identification accuracy was above chance or not. Then we try to see whether more musicians will achieve above chance performance in these different visual field conditions. And then the general finding is that we found that more musicians achieve above chance level performance in the central right visual field region. So this is these two locations, the locations I circle here, than non-musicians. And however, we didn't find this in Chinese characters or in some other novel symbol identification. So this is pretty unique to English stimuli. And we also look at music. So we also have music stimuli. And then we found something similar, that we found that in music note identification, musicians outperform non-musicians in accuracy also in the center right visual field condition. So in other words, in both music notes, the visual span for music note and the visual span for English letter identification, there seems to be an advantage, consistent advantage in the center right visual field location. So it's suggesting, so it's consistent with the idea that there seems to be a right visual field enhancement effect in the visual span in musicians. Okay, quick summary for this study. So here we showed that music reading experience enhances English letter and music note identification, particularly in the central right visual field. And why is this the case? We speculate that it could be a perceptual learning effect because English and music reading involve left to right sequential symbol processing, but Chinese character reading, Chinese reading doesn't involve, it can be read from different directions, and then it's not really sequential simple processing from left to right. So it suggests that the moderation of music reading experience on the visual span for stimulus identification in bilinguals would depend on the similarities in the perceptual processing involved. Okay, so this is just a very quick summary of what we did in the past. So after these two studies, then we studied to speculate that now we know music reading experience can moderate visual word processing and also visual span in English reading, but not in Chinese reading. Then we speculate that maybe can it also modulate visual processing during sentence reading, such as eye movement planning. And however, eye movement planning is a very complicated process during sentence reading because it's not only related to perceptual processes, it is also related to underlying language processes. So we need to think about this question a little bit more carefully. Then we look into the literature, indeed, in terms of moderation effect from music experience to language processing. We found that in general, music training is shown to enhance sensitivity to regularities in sentence structure. And this sensitivity can influence eye movement planning during sentence reading. So for example, it has been shown that in musicians, linguistic and music incongruities elicit similar ERP P600 responses. So this is related to syntactic processing. So based on, actually there are several studies like findings similar results. So these researchers argue that there may be shared neural mechanisms in syntactic processing between music and language. Okay, so based on this, then in this study, we hypothesized that violations in structural regularities may affect musicians' language processing more than non-musicians because musicians are just more sensitive to structural regularities. And then so they might have longer reading time if there's a syntactic violation. But this effect should be observed for bilinguals. This effect should be observed in both English and Chinese. However, whether this effect will be reflected in the eye movement planning behavior, then it may depend on whether they share similar perceptual demands or perceptual processes. So in contrast, it may affect eye movement planning behavior, including where they look and the order of where they look in English reading more than in Chinese reading due to the similarities in perceptual demands between English and music reading. So in order to answer this question, then we try to apply, so the eye movement measures that we're interested in is that we try to measure their overall eye movement pattern quantified by this new technique that we have been developing in the lab, eye movement analysis with hidden Markov models. And we also look at Sakha lens because previous study, we have shown that it seems to be something related to visual span. So it could be related to Sakha lens. Okay. And this is the design of our current study. So in this study, we recruited 86 Chinese English bilinguals. And then half of them are musicians, the other half are non-musicians. And we try to match them as closely as possible, but we found that there's one thing difficult to match. So basically musicians, they tend to have higher verbal working memory. So we just include it as a covariate in our analysis. And here we have 4 types of stimulus. We have English sentences, Chinese sentences, music notations, and Tibetan sentences. And then for each stimulus type, we manipulate the sentence type. Either they will be legal original image, or they could be semantically incorrect. So you can see the examples here. And then they could be just random word list. And then the manipulation looks like this. So the original sentences are legal sentences. Semantically incorrect means that we change one word to make it semantically incorrect, such as here, the sun must brewing from the east. And then for the random word list, we just take the semantically incorrect sentences and then try to randomize the word order. And just to note that for music notation and Tibetan sentences, so Tibetan sentences, we included as a condition where the stimuli are unfamiliar to participants. So in these two conditions, then we don't really have a semantically incorrect condition. So for these two stimulus type, we will only manipulate whether it's original legal sentence or notation or whether it's random word list. Okay. And this is the procedure for English and Chinese stimuli. So it goes like this. It's an eye tracking study. After the drift correction, then we will ask participants to look at a dot on the left-hand side where the beginning of sentence will be. Then we'll present the sentence, and then participants will read the sentence. And then after they finish reading, then they will press a key. Then you will go to the next screen. The next screen will ask them a question to make sure that they understand the sentence. So this is a yes/no question, such as, for example, the sun must rise from the east. And then the question will be, must the sun rise from the east? And then they answer yes or no. So this is just to make sure they read the sentences. And for music and Tibetan, it's pretty similar, except that we can, because there's no semantics, we cannot really ask a comprehension question. So we ask them to do a word recognition question. So after the presentation of the notation or a Tibetan sentence, we ask them whether these symbols appear in the previous phrase or these musical notes appear in the previous phrase. And then for musicians, we just try to make sure that they try to measure their expertise in music reading. So we will also do a auditory musical phrase matching task. So after they answer the recognition question, we will play a musical phrase, then ask them to judge whether the phrase the presented phrase matches the one they have just seen. Okay, so these are the procedure of the task, and I want to spend a little bit time to introduce how we're going to analyze the eye movement data. So this is a technique that we have developed since 2013, 14. So it's been several years, and we apply these methods for several other visual tasks already, including face recognition, visual search, scene perception, website viewing, and lots of different things. So the original idea of this is that we know there's substantial individual differences in eye movements in visual tasks, and these individual differences can indicate differences in strategy or cognitive style. But traditional methods, such as use regional interest to divide the visual stimulus into different regions of interest and just count number of fixation in different regions, or like fixation map just to generate a heat map according to where they look at. So these traditional approaches, they don't adequately reflect individual differences in eye movement pattern. And in particular, they don't really reflect temporal information in eye movement patterns. So that's why we thought about to propose a better method to analyze eye movement data. And our idea is to use hidden Markov models. And the purpose is to provide quantitative assessment of individual differences in eye movement patterns, taking both spatial and temporal dimensions. So in other words, where participants look and also the order of where they look into account. Okay, a very quick introduction to our approach. So in this approach, what we want to do is that we will first summarize an individual's eye movement with a hidden Markov model. So here I use face recognition as an example because it's where we started. The general idea is that we will try to first discover personalized regional interests by fitting Gaussian mixture models to the distribution of this person's fixations. So for example, for this person, he only looks at these three regions. So then these will be his personalized region of interest. And after we discover the ROIs, then we can summarize the transition probabilities among ROIs into this transition matrix. So you can see in this transition matrix, the prior indicates the probability that this person's first fixation would land in different ROIs. For example, this participant will have the most likely, or like 58% of probability, will start looking at this face by a fixation into the green ROI. Now afterwards, then the probability of transitions will be summarized into this transition probability here. For example, after the first fixation in the green region, then the second fixation is also most likely, or in other words, 57% of probability to be still within the green region. but 80% probability will switch to the red region, or 25 will switch from the green region to the blue region. So this will basically summarize the person's eye movement pattern when this person is viewing a face. And then, so now remember, we use one model to summarize one person's eye movement pattern. So we have lots of individual models, one model for one participant. Then what we can do is that we can do clustering. So these are individual models. We can use clustering algorithms to discover inside the population whether they are representative eye movement patterns among the population. So you can see, for example, participant number 1 and number 2 have more similar eye movement patterns, and number 3 and number 4 have more similar eye movement patterns. Then after clustering, then the participant number 1 and 2 will be grouped together, and 3 and 4 will be grouped together. And just to give you an example, in face recognition, then if you do this, then you will discover that some people will only look, when they are viewing faces, they mainly look at the nose. And then some people will be looking more to the facial features, such as individual eyes and nose. So we call this eyes nose pattern. Okay, then after you discover the representative eye movement patterns from the population, because it's a machine learning based approach, you can quantify similarities of individual data to these representative patterns using machine learning approaches, such as calculating the log likelihood of the data being generated by the representative models. So for example, you can quantify, I just told you that we discovered these 2 representative patterns in face recognition. Then you can quantify for each individual's data. And for example, this person's eye movement pattern is like this. Then you can quantify that it's actually more similar to the representative nose focus pattern. And this is a very eyes nose pattern. And then these are kind of in between. And then you can quantify them by calculating the likelihood that these data are being generated by the eyes nose pattern or the nose focus pattern. Okay, once you have this quantitative measures of similarities among eye movement patterns, then you can use this similarity measure to examine the relationship between eye movement pattern and other measures. So for example, in one study, we found that among older adults, the more nose focused their eye movement pattern is, the lower their cognitive ability is. Okay, so it's a very quick introduction to this approach. And so this approach we have applied to lots of different visual tasks. And I think the methodology, in terms of methodology, is pretty mature to be applied to all sorts of visual tasks. But we haven't really applied to reading that much, because reading, eye movement studies in reading is a very specialized area. So in recent years, just this year, we started to apply this method to look at eye movements in reading. And so this is kind of one of the early studies that earliest attempts to apply this method to look at eye movements in reading. So it's kind of good timing here to advertise the method in this group of audience. So what we're doing here is, remember in the current design, we had different stimulus type or sentence types. So for each sentence type, we summarize an individual's eye movement pattern in a sentence type condition using a hidden Markov model. Then we will cluster all individual models to discover 2 representative eye movement patterns. And let's assume it's pattern A and pattern B. Then we will try to quantify each participant's overall eye movement pattern along the dimension contrasting pattern A and pattern B by using this equation. So basically here means that we use the A stands for the log likelihood of participants' eye movement pattern being generated by the representative model of A. So it basically it indicates how similar the pattern is to this representative pattern A. And B means how similar it is to the representative pattern B. And this is just to normalize it. And in general, so if you use this AB scale, a more positive value will indicate a higher similarity to pattern A. Okay, so we're going to use this measure in our eye movement analysis. I hope you still can follow me. Oh, yeah, so now let's go to the results. So first we look at the English sentence reading time between musicians and non-musicians. So we found there's a interaction. It's a little bit weird that the lines all disappear, but it's okay. So we found there's a music expertise by sentence type interaction. And then in general, the general finding is that as compared with non-musicians, musicians spend more time viewing random than semantically incorrect sentences, as you can see here. So suggesting that, although this effect, so in general, participants will spend more time reading random word list. And however, this effect is bigger among musicians, suggesting that musicians' reading fluency was more affected by syntactic violations than non-musicians. And it's more exciting to look at the eye movement data. So remember, so we cluster everyone's model into two patterns, trying to discover representative patterns. And this is what we discovered. So there are two representative patterns we discovered. In one, we call it more dispersed pattern because basically it started from either the red or blue region, but it has a very big ROI, which means that there's no consistency in where their first fixation is. It could be everywhere all over the place. And then let's assume they start from red, then they'll pretty much stay in red. And if they start from blue, then pretty much stay in blue. And then sometimes, very occasionally, they will go to the beginning of the sentence. But the sequence, but in pattern B, which we call a more sequential pattern, then you kind of see a more sequential pattern that they will start most likely to look at the center of the sentence first, and then they will move from red to green with a very high probability. So they will try to read the sentence from the beginning, right? And then after that, then from green, they either stay in green or they move to the blue region, which is the later part of the sentence. So it looks like this is more similar to our regular reading habit. So that's why we call it as a sequential pattern. So if you discover these two patterns, then you can quantify them using AB scale. But here we change the name to DS scale because it's like a dispersed sequential pattern. Okay, so now remember, now we call it DS scale. Okay, and if you look at DS scale, then it's something interesting. We found that for reading English sentences, if you compare the original condition versus the random word list condition, there's a sentence type by music expertise interaction. So the general finding is that musicians show a more sequential pattern when reading original sentences than random word list. So you can see there's a difference between, so this is DS scale. So they are more dispersed when they are reading random word list as compared with original legal sentences. But this difference was not observed in non-musicians. So in other words, it seems to suggest that musicians' eye movement planning behavior was affected more by syntactic violations than non-musicians. Okay, so this is for English data. Then let's move on to for Chinese sentence data. For Chinese sentence reading time, we observe something pretty similar. So basically, participants, it doesn't matter whether musicians or non-musicians, their reading time will be longer when they are reading the random word list. However, the effect is stronger in musicians than as compared with non-musicians. So in other words, musicians' reading fluency was affected by this kind of violation more than non-musicians. In terms of eye movement data, we found, again, something very similar. So we found one pattern is very dispersed, so there's no regularity. They just all over the place. And however, the sequential pattern, they see something familiar, very similar to the English pattern that participant will start from looking at the center of sentence, then move on to the beginning of sentence, and then move on to the rest of the sentence. Okay, however, so this is very similar to the two representative patterns discovered are very similar to English reading, but there was no effect in DS scale. So there's no difference between musicians and non-musicians. We only observe some differences, some effects, some main effect of sentence type in saccade length. So participants, they made longer saccades when reading original sentences compared with other types of sentences. But this effect didn't differ between musicians and non-musicians. Okay, so this is Chinese, and then move on to music. So in terms of the music notation viewing time, Then similar to the English and Chinese data, we also observe an interaction between music expertise and sentence type. So we found that the reading time difference between the original versus random word list conditions was significant in musicians, but not in non-musicians. So this is not surprising because for non-musicians, they have no idea about the difference between a legal music notation versus an illegal music notation. And only musicians know. And that's why you get this effect. So musicians' reading fluency was affected by syntactic irregularities, whereas non-musicians was not. And we also found that this effect in musicians was correlated with their performance in auditory musical phrase matching, suggesting that this is really related to their musical expertise. And how about the eye movement pattern? And similarly, we discovered one pattern, one representative pattern is more diverse. I think the difference here is not as salient as English and Chinese reading, but you can roughly see in general, the one pattern is still more dispersed and the other one is still more starting from 1 and either move to 2 or 3. So it's not as sequential as the language cases, but still it has a better our regularities in ROI choices rather than this one is basically there's no regularities. Okay, and in here, we didn't find any effects in BS scale, but we found some effects in Sakha lengths. So we found that musicians had longer Sakha lengths when viewing original phrases than random segments. And by non-musicians didn't have this difference because they actually basically couldn't tell the difference. So in other words, musicians were more sensitive to irregularities in music reading as revealed in Sakha lengths. And this is again correlated with musicians' performance in this auditory musical phrase matching. Okay, now the Tibetan data. So here we found something interesting because for musicians and non-musicians, they have no experience with reading Tibetan sentences or viewing Tibetan sentences. And so this is really just to see whether their expertise will be transferred to an unfamiliar alphabetic language. And we found that a main effect of music expertise, so musicians, they somehow will spend more time viewing the stimuli than non-musicians, maybe because they like to analyze the stimuli, spend more time to look at stimuli, even though they don't read Tibetan sentences. But this didn't interact with sentence type. Okay, and in terms of eye movement pattern, we discovered something very similar to music, to the eye movement pattern for music notation. So one is relatively dispersed and the other is relatively sequential, but again, they are not as, the difference between these two patterns is not as clear as in English or Chinese cases. And we also didn't find the effect in BS scale, but we found effects in Sakha lengths. So we found that musicians had longer average Sakha lengths when viewing original sentences than random word lists. So this effect is similar to music reading results, but you didn't see this effect in non-musicians. So this is interesting, but the effect is very small. So I just want to emphasize, but this is interesting because musicians actually have no idea which sentences are legal, which sentences are illegal in Tibetan, but somehow they still show this behavior. And then after the experiment, we actually asked them whether they can distinguish, which sentences are legal, which sentences are illegal, and then they say they have no idea. So this is kind of interesting. Okay, so a quick summary of what we found here. So we found that in Chinese English bilingual musicians, reading fluency was disturbed by syntactic violations more than non-musicians in reading English sentences, Chinese sentences, and music notations. However, in contrast to this result, the eye movement planning behavior in reading English sentences and music notations was also disturbed by syntactic violations, whereas non-musicians' eye movement planning behavior was not. And we found a similar effect in eye movement planning behavior when they are viewing a familiar alphabetic language Tibetan. But this effect, this sensitivity to syntactic violations was not observed in eye movement planning behavior during Chinese sentence reading. Okay, so then we were thinking about why this is the case. And then, as you probably have noticed, the effect in English was observed in this DS scale, which means that it's in where they look, the overall eye movement pattern, where they look, and the order of where they look. And but in music, it was in staccato length. And although the effect direction is the same. So we speculate that actually, although this effect was observed in both music, English, and Tibetan, they might involve different cognitive mechanisms. So we know in music, it's probably, we already showed that it's associated with their expertise in notation sound mapping, because we found the correlations with their mapping performance. And the reason why it's not observed in DS scale, we speculate it might be because the stimuli used were too short. They are only 4 bars. So, and however, the violation of the diatonic rules in music typically depend on the relationship across multiple segments. So maybe it's just too short to allow you to see the effect in DS scale. So that's why you only see the effect in staccato length. And we speculate in English, we actually see the effect in DS scale, which reflecting their eye movement planning behavior, where they look, and the order way of where they look. And this eye movement planning behavior may be more related to their executive function or planning abilities for sentence understanding. And in Tibetan, because they don't actually understand the language, they don't actually read the language. So the reason why they are showing this eye movement behavior could be related to their ability to analyze regularities in sequential structures. But of course, these are just our speculations. We need more studies to see whether this is true. But in general, this speculation is consistent with the literature suggesting that music training is a multifaceted effect. It can lead to multifaceted benefits to one's cognitive ability development. It could include executive function, planning, or selective attention abilities. And indeed, some researchers have proposed that music expertise may be better understood as a multi-dimensional factor. So it wouldn't be just affect one type of processes. It can actually affect different types of processes in different situations. So a quick conclusion of what we found in this study. So generally, we want to show that music reading experience may modulate eye movement planning behavior in reading sentences in bilinguals to language differentially, depending on their similarities in perceptual processing demands to music reading. And our finding also suggests that how skills in the perceptual expertise domain, such as music notation reading, can influence processes involved in other domains, such as learning to read in English, Chinese, or another language, depend on the similarities of the processes involved. Okay, and just want to acknowledge that this is a study done by my former student, Sarah Lee, and the current student, Anita Liao, and also in collaboration with Susanna Chang from Berkeley. And I want to acknowledge that the development of EMHMM is with Professor Anthony Chen from CTU. And if you are interested in using our data analysis method, you can download the toolbox here, or if you have any questions, you can ask me as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Janet, for the very interesting talk. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, I wonder if you have looked at musician versus non-musician differences in face recognition and the patterns of face processing. Well, I'm asking this because in the last study you showed that there are some differences in sentence reading, right? In terms of the visual fixation patterns. And I happen to know that for people with congenital amusia, there's some results showing that they have a problem with face recognition. So I wonder if the opposite can be found for musicians, in that they may show better face recognition and perhaps different patterns. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. So we haven't thought about that musicians and non-musicians can differ in eye pattern for face recognition as well. But this is something that we can do in the future. So maybe if musicians tend to be more into analyzing the structure. So it could be, because remember there are two general EMHMM patterns. One is basically only look at the notes. And then there are studies suggesting that when you only look at notes, you are using more low spatial frequency information, kind of getting a more overview global process on phase. If you look at individual features, you're using high spatial frequencies, it means that you are analyzing the local features. So it's possible that musicians may tend to use a more analytic strategy, but it's just my speculation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also wonder about individual differences because I know in at least in the music to auditory or speech transfer, people not only look at musicians and non-musicians as two discrete groups, but also look at individual differences on the continuum by measuring their objective musical aptitude. So I wonder, I mean, for musical reading experience, possibly also individual differences in that they may spend different amounts of time every day reading music, right? So I wonder if that's something worth looking into and probably could provide further corroborating evidence for the effects that you found here.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I believe my students also majored, but it's just a subjective measure from a questionnaire, like how often they read music notations. So they probably already did the correlation, maybe didn't find anything. That's why they didn't say anything. You know? However, we in this study, we measure MSI, you know, that it's like also the music aptitude measure, but it's a questionnaire, it's subjective, it's not very objective, just asking you. And then they have 5 different scales, such as like how much you into, I forgot the names. One is about singing ability, and maybe like another expression, music expression. So there are questions about like how much money and resources you put into music, the kind of questions, and they define 5 scales. And then, so we try to correlate those scales with the effect we observe here. And in general, it's consistent with our speculation here. I think we found that, because all these scales are highly correlated, first of all. But if we do some kind of stepwise regression just to see which MSI index is the best predictor for the effects we observe here, I remember for English, it's more related to singing ability, which is a little bit hard to explain. But we look into the literature for the questions they ask in that particular index for singing ability seem to be particularly related to executive function and planning. And I remember for Tibetan, it's more, the best predictor was the one with music expression. So might be related to some kind of tendency to analyze things. Yeah, I didn't put it here because it's difficult to explain what those indexes mean. Yeah, but I think just like here, I think maybe in terms of music research, we need to find better indexes to understand it better, because it's a very multifaceted ability. So sometimes it's difficult to tease them apart. And I think in the subjective measure MSI is a good step, but in any case, it's just a questionnaire, very subjective. So I think we need to think about better ways to tease apart different contributing factors underlying music expertise.
Yeah, and one last question. So basically your finding consistently showed some transfer from the music reading experience to English, but not to Chinese reading, right? But we know that there are a lot of differences between these two writing systems or visual word processing. You mentioned such as the left to right direction different. That's similar, but also like the horizontal, the kind of the sequential processing. So I wonder if there is a way to further tease apart the contribution of various factors here, because of there are quite a lot of differences between English and Chinese.
Yeah, you're right. So these are mostly just our speculation. So it should be that way, and then try to see whether it's indeed. So I guess we need to again, think about like other measures that can quantify these differences between Chinese and English reading. Then we can use those measures, the quantitative measures, to see whether these effects are correlated with those measures. Yeah, that could be for future study, I guess.
Right. So for instance, I think for Arabic, right? Like Arabic, it's the direction of the reading is different from English, also different from music, but it's sort of sequential, right? So I wonder if by looking at some other languages, it's whether it's possible to disentangle these different factors.
Yeah, that's a very good suggestion. So you mean that for Arabic, it's from right to left. So in theory, you shouldn't get any effects from music expertise. Yeah, it could be our next study for my students. Maybe. Thank you.
Okay, very good conversations between the two speakers. So let's allow one more question. So any questions from the online audience? No. Okay. So maybe I take this opportunity to ask one question. So actually, it's a follow-up question from Cai. Cai mentioned the face recognition, right? For normal people, I mean non-musicians, may use the strategy of a holistic processing for face recognition, right? And if we make some fake faces, components from two different persons, I'm not sure whether musicians and non-musicians will show different effectiveness in recognize such fake faces in terms of processing time and maybe eye movement patterns. I'm not sure.
What do you mean by fake faces? You mean like
components from two different faces?
Oh, yeah. I think because from the studies, it's just my intuition that musicians like to analyze structures, right? So if they do pay more attention to features, kind of try to analyze the features, then they may have better ability to discover that these are different, facial features from different people than non-musicians. That would be my guess, but we need to test it, of course.
Sure, yeah. Sure. Thank you very much. Okay.